It is a immense pleasure to introduce our guest today, Professor Partha Ghosh, Professor of Practice and Economics here at the Gordon Institute. Mr. Partha is also a distinguished advisor to several heads of states around the world, and it's indeed a privilege for us to study economics under his tutelage here. And we're hoping that this section that will cover economics in depth, coming from a distinguished professor, would help answer some of the questions everybody has. With that, welcome, Mr. Partha Ghosh. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Let us begin by asking you what your view is around the status of the global economy.
And I think the world is in a true state of economic transition from the old paradigm to the new paradigm. I see several positive elements, which I think we should embrace, as well as see some very, very strong negative elements as well. The positive elements, I sense a tremendous amount of confidence and sense of self-determination in the emerging countries like China, Brazil, India, several Southeast Asian countries, several African countries, which is extremely positive. For the first time in history, we could see, particularly in China, close to 1 billion coming out of the poverty into the middle class regime. The other positive thing I sense that people are becoming more knowledgeable thanks to internet, thanks to television, which is something that we should embrace. The third element, which I'm extremely proud of, is that there are a lot of non-profit organizations around the world, particularly from the United States, which are trying to reach out to the challenges people are facing at the base of the pyramid. So these are all very positive. But at the same time, there are several negative elements. Number one, as you know, that the United States is in a state of gridlock, the debt crisis. European Union is in a state of gridlock as well. There's a debt crisis there. Japan has got a very, very high debt, close to 230% of the GDP. Now, these are all developed countries that we are talking about. If they are suffering from debt, the developing countries have very little to look up to as successful economic models. That bothers me a lot. Then, of course, the increasing gap between rich and poor. If you look at even the Occupy Wall Street movement, it is in a country like the United States, 90% of the people do not feel that they're part of the mainstream. And that's something we should be worried about. And the third element that I'm worried about is the distrust people have, the common people, in governments, where we are facing very difficult problems of our times. But the people who are supposed to solve those problems, people are not trusting those institutions. So obviously that creates a tremendous amount of drag into the goodness that you can bring to society. So the challenge on one side, how to take these positive elements, package it, at the same time, how to address some of the very fundamental cancers, if you will, economic cancers that we have to address. So I think that's where I feel we need a new paradigm, new way of relating with people around the world to create a new, buoyant, safe, and fertile economic setup.
Great, thank you for that. I remember when you first started off our lecture on economics here, you took us to a journey of economics for the past 2,000 years, starting with Kautilya and Plato and Marx, and most recently Krugman and Friedman. And that provides us a concise evolution of economic thoughts. What do you think, or where do you think we're actually headed in terms of economics?
Yeah, I think, if you look at the last 2,000 years, we have come a long way. If you go back to the Aristotles and Kautilya's and Plato's of the world, they used to worry about ethics, fairness, what is a fair price, how much should a king rent the land to a common farmer, and how should he set the price of the produce of the land. And both sides, the king had more say than the producer. And that led thought leaders like Aristotle start thinking of the whole question of fairness, fair price, ownership. But from Aristotle to all the way down to Adam Smith, which is almost a gap of almost close to 2,000 years, nothing much really happened except there were several centers of trade like the Venice and Baghdad and London emerged as the centers of economic trade. But with Adam Smith, there's a new thinking evolved around the power of self-interest. And what Adam Smith really preached is how to organize these forces of self-interest into an economic system. If it works with limited government, markets work, in the process communities, societies become rich. That was Adam Smith, but then came Karl Marx, who talked about Well, as communities become rich, some people would end up making more money while others will get commoditized, and the gap between rich and poor would increase. So now we have come to a point where we are seeing some of the predictions of Marx. At the same time, we have seen, including China, for example, which is basically a communistic state, is kind of absorbing the thoughts of Adam Smith. So the question now, I think, is on one side, how do we, you mentioned Friedman, embrace the freedom to choose? On the other side, ensure that the central economic powers bring the goodness of society to the people at the base of the pyramid. So I think we have to play on the both extremes. On one side, we have to ensure that people do have the freedom to pursue their self-interest. At the same time, the role of the government is to strategically guide those interests towards a common purpose for the common goodness of society. So I think in the next 30, 50 years, I would see some new types of isms which will evolve, which would be different from capitalism or socialism. I don't know what to call it. I call it Xism. And X has got double meaning. X is yet to be defined. At the same time, X could mean we have to be at the cross currents of multiple thoughts, which will define the next ism, which will create perhaps a significantly more fair world where everyone will have the opportunity to be part of the global economic system.
It's interesting that you mentioned Friedman and Krugman, because both of them have differing opinions of macroeconomic policies, and they've portrayed that very differently for economic development. Where do you stand on your views, because you just mentioned about them also, on how these two are explaining the policies of economic development?
You know, one of the shortcomings of modern times is that people have become extremely digital. Perhaps it's the effect of the digital economy that is either 0 or 1. So I would not rule out one over the other. I think firstly, as a problem solver, I like to see that we have enough resiliency in our mind to accommodate extreme thoughts. Now, I like the thoughts of Friedman in terms of the significance of having the freedom to choose. But as soon as I have the freedom to choose, I have a responsibility that I'm making the right choices. So if I don't have the education, I do not have access to the social infrastructure, chances are I'll make the wrong choices. It's nice to talk about freedom to choose, but at the same time, we have to talk about the people who will provide me access to the social infrastructure so that I can make the right choices. So that's why Krugman comes in. And Krugman talks about the role of the government, and particularly in times of depression or in times when we're going through downward cycle, the government has a very important role to play to ensure that people who are particularly closer to the base of the pyramid do not suffer too much, and at the same time ensure people who are at the top of the pyramid develop the social consciousness that it's not good enough to be rich alone. You want to be part of a rich club, and you want the club to have as many members as you could perhaps accommodate. So I think I feel there's space for both, and that's why I don't think economics should be a single vector economics, as if you have to be either in this end or the other end. The multiple dimensions that we have to bring into play to really develop the 21st century economy. Keeping in mind there are a lot of different technologies at play, you know, the internet, the Twitter, the Facebook, they are creating a social consciousness much faster than we could have created in the 70s. In the last 40 years, things have changed, and we have to understand what does it mean in terms of social interactions, because at the end of the day, economics is a science of social interactions. How do we reward each other? How do we help each other? How do we cheat each other? And of course, we want to keep the cheating side as zero as possible, whereas we want to see the helping side, the conscience, the human conscience, get celebrated to create a community where everyone could be part of the economic buoyancy.
And about the cheating, that's another thing that countries around the world are struggling, and you're a strategic advisor to heads of government. So how do you, or what do you think would be the key advice or points to take for countries like the US and UK, and other East Asian countries to get out of this vicious cycle of busts and booms?
It goes back to, again, Adam Smith. Adam Smith particularly underscored the importance of self-interest. But self-interest in a world which is very complex could often lead to people short-circuiting certain connections. And in the process, it becomes, quote-unquote, sometimes unconsciously, which is not fair, or which could be termed cheating. Now, unfortunately, people who have the luxury to make those cheating part of their professional life almost, they have a tremendous amount of powers, like heads of banks, what you saw in Wall Street in 2007, 2008. They could bring down economies very rapidly. So I think it's important that as we move into the 21st century, as economic decision-making gets more and more concentrated, today's banks are 10 times, 20 times bigger than the banks 10 years ago. So obviously, one wrong decision could hurt the economy very badly. So that's where, again, there's a role of the government in two sides of the spectrum. One is in the education system should be such that we could build in a sense of ethics into individuals in a much stronger fashion, that you think twice before you short circuit. And at the same time, the government should be smart enough to be able to regulate those mechanisms where things could go wrong. Sometimes it's too late, as we saw from the Lehman crisis. And I think we have to avoid those. And at the end of the day, people who end up paying are people at the base of the pyramid. People who have made those decisions where banks have been brought down, economic systems have been brought down, they kind of enjoy their life as maybe not as smoothly as they could have before, but they move on. But the people at the base of the pyramid keep on struggling. So I would like to see that economic system which can definitely support the self-interest bit so that we could be all upwardly mobile. But it should be all upwardly mobile, not only few moving upwards and many either settling there without hope or somehow continues to struggle but still finds a lot of different kinds of ceiling which does not allow him or her to move upwards.
So far you've talked about the United States, European Union, and other developed nations. How do you view the challenges for the emerging economies, and what can we learn from them?
I think the challenges are perhaps even more serious in the emerging economies. Let me first talk about the positive side. Even within the positive side, there's some embedded challenges. Firstly, as you know, when you look at a country like China, which has done extremely well in the last 30 years, but clearly the rich and the poor are separating out. So the first question would be, as you pursue a high-growth economic trajectory, how to make it all-inclusive. And that's not easy. And we have seen, and if you don't make it all-inclusive, there could always be some kind of a social unrest, which could be a drag to the development of an economy. That's point number one. Point number two, the challenge is all about how do you manage the infrastructure of the country? Because what's the tendency is, as soon as the country starts taking off, you build nice airports, nice highways, but this is typically for the top 20% of the specific economy. We rarely think of, particularly when I look at India, that how would the common lives infrastructure has to be established. And it could be, for example, hospitals, primary schools, water supply, healthcare, and often these elements get neglected in the fast-moving economies because people feel we have to quickly catch up, so we will build a great stock exchange. We'll build beautiful cities, some nice airports, and some nice pubs within the cities, and we feel, wow, we are now looking like a city of London. But the point is, what we forget often to include the other 70%. I think that's the second challenge. The third one is being intelligent about economic progress, because where I get concerned, that particularly when I look at China, that many of the economic models China is trying to embrace, they are Western models which West is questioning, like the thermal power plants. Every week one new thermal power plant is built. Shouldn't China think of new ways of managing energy, new ways of managing economic models which are significantly more conservation-centric, significantly based on renewable energy, and at the same time develop infrastructure which is significantly more decentralized as opposed to trying to create an infrastructure around cities. Now, how many Shanghais could we have? I mean, there are maybe 10 cities in China, which are Shanghai-like, but it cannot accommodate 1.2 billion people. So I think developing countries should be more intelligent in terms of what could be the next economic structures that we could create, which could be different from the Western model. And I see that is missing now, which is a bit of a shame, because it is easier for developing countries to adopt a new model as opposed to developed countries, because there's a tremendous amount of momentum of behaviors. If I'm used to air conditioning, I'm used to driving, I'm used to being wasteful, it's very difficult to change that behavior. But if I'm not consuming much because I'm poor, it is easy to switch me towards a model which is significantly more intelligent in terms of how we consume global resources. How do we interact with nature? I think those are the real challenges of emerging economies.
Those are definitely some critical pain points you hit on. In your opinion, how much regulation do you think is appropriate for a developing nation versus a developed nation?
I firstly believe that every economy needs some kind of a regulatory body. But the nature of regulation, for example, we need in the United States would be different from the nature of regulation, for example, we might need in a country like Kenya. Because in the early stage of development, much of the regulation of the country would be typically very strategic. That how do we regulate the economy in such a way that the common person could become part of the economic movement, which again goes back to education, healthcare, social infrastructures, and that's where you focus much of the regulatory attention. But when you look at a developed country like US or Japan, I think much of the role of the government, for example, in Japan, is how to bring the aging population in the economic system so that people beyond 65 do not become a liability, but you want to make them asset by creating jobs where people who are older than 65 could still participate in the economy. So they are both provider of services as well as user of services. In other words, you keep the engine moving by using people who are older than 65. So obviously there's a role of the government to create platforms on which innovation could occur, where the private market could participate to get older people involved in the economic system. Similarly, in the United States, earlier we were talking about the collapse of Wall Street. Perhaps we questioned the whole ethics of decision-making at the top of the pyramid. There again, there's the role of the government, how to ensure that people do not make wrong choices, or when they make choices, they're thinking of the common good or social good as opposed to individual benefits. So I think regulations are important. I think often people feel if we're talking about regulation, we are trying to be too socialistic or communistic. And I think that's a very, very misplaced, if you will, term. I think it's the government is in fact becoming more important these days because we are part of the global setup. The linkages are very complex, and you need someone to guide how these linkages between economies would work and how we should ensure that the economy that I am in charge of, if I'm running a country, is indeed competitive.
It seems like U.S. companies are making record profits today, and shareholders are securing great returns, while the common person is getting commoditized and unemployment is continuing. What do you think should be the economic strategy for the U.S.?
I think there are two challenges we are faced with here. One is when I think of capitalism, the way it is shaped in the United States, it has become a very transactional capitalism, which means that if I made someone the chairman of a company, let's say a company like General Motors or GE, I feel ashamed that the chairman has to be incented with special options and huge salaries. I think it's an honor to be the chairman of a company. So if I paid only $500,000, I'll be extremely happy. And not because of the salary, but the responsibility that I've been entrusted with to drive the future flagship of a country like GE or General Motors. Now, I don't know why the salary structures of CEOs have become so out of place, and how come we are not helping individuals to enjoy the honor of leading as opposed to getting paid in terms of the kind of transactions they bring to play. So that's point number one. The point number two, because of globalization, the companies seek places where they will have the cheapest labor, lowest cost resources, which is fine because their responsibility is to serve the shareholder. And today shareholders are also globalized. A company like GE may be owned by Germans, might be owned by Japanese or Chinese, or as much as may be owned by Americans. So in the globalized world, it's very easy to see labor in any part of the world, as Karl Marx would say, get commoditized. So it is the responsibility of the government to ensure, through the education system, that the kind of skills that are imparted in individuals, the country's people at the base of the pyramid are always competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Now, obviously, if you look at a country like China, where the labor rate may be $3.50 an hour, versus the United States, where it's $30 an hour, if the skill levels are same, you would choose a Chinese worker. But if you could have the US workers to do certain things which others cannot do, obviously you would use the US worker because he or she could provide services and skills which people in the other parts of the world may not. So I think it's in this country, what I think we have missed. On one side, we have made the capitalism very transactional at the top of the pyramid and at the bottom of the pyramid. That's why you look for the cheapest labor. You're always looking at people in terms of dollars and cents, as opposed to the focus should have been on more relational capitalism. That how do I build relationships which is more than dollars and cents, but I want to work with a group of people where I could create value for society. And the reason we come together, because we value what we do first. And I think when the economies become more advanced, that should be the center focus of economic system. Transaction is important when you are in an emerging mode because everyone wants to become a bit richer. But once you have got 2 homes and 5 cars and 10 television sets and 15 cell phones, I don't think you should be incented on the basis of how many more cell phones you can have. I think it's more the nature of the responsibility that you could take on to serve the world.
Definitely. And you talked a little bit about the financial incentives for top-level executives at companies like GE. But in today's world, the price of goods in the U.S. continues to rise, while the salary of a typical worker does not. How long do you think such a trend will continue? And what would you, as a policy advisor, recommend to take the U.S. out of this vicious cycle of boom and bust?
This is a $1 trillion question, but let's see whether I could segment it in different parts. The first one is about, why are the prices rising? The prices are rising because there are a lot of new demand coming from emerging countries. So when you think of copper, when you think of steel, when you think of hydrocarbons, they're limited supply. And there are billions of people who are coming into the marketplace. So obviously the prices of commodities go up because you have limited supply, unlimited demand. So obviously there would be the supply-demand equations coming into play to determine the price. In the same spirit, because of globalization, if there's a cheaper labor somewhere else, so today a U.S. labor, whether he's working in McDonald's or she's working in Starbucks or working in a factory somewhere in the Midwest, he or she has to be competitive vis-a-vis someone in Vietnam. Now, so his or her wage rate per hour is getting determined by someone who did not have a job or works at $3 an hour in Vietnam. On the other side, the price that he pays is also getting determined by the global demand. So in such a setup, the question that you really want me to answer is, what should a society do so that I can, on one side, keep limit on the prices, on the other side, help to increase the wage rate? And obviously, there's a need for innovation so that you become less and less dependent on commodities, which has limited supply. And that's why the whole move towards renewable resources, or moving towards, for example, resources available in the United States. For example, shale gas people are talking about, tight oil we are talking about. On the other side, we have to continuously inject skills within the working population so they could indeed command higher wage rates because they provide skills which others can't. So that's again underscores the point I was making earlier, the role of the government. And someone has to strategically manage both the supply and the demand side of the equations.
So Dr. Ghosh, in the previous questions, you touched a little bit on the economic disparity between the rich and the poor. And in the US, the economic disparity between the rich and the poor has increased more rapidly in the last 20 years than in previous times in history. Why do you think this is, and what remedies would you propose to restore the spirit of the American dream?
No, it links with the previous question, actually. Firstly, it's a global phenomenon. Unfortunately, the gap between rich and poor is increasing. But let's go to the fundamental reasons why that's happening. Now, it really boils down to the quote-unquote, the term I will use, competitiveness of economies, competitiveness of the companies. Now, as a leader of a company, what you really worry about is to make your company competitive. To make your company competitive, you have to have access to the lowest cost resources in the world, have the highest productivity, create the most value per capita, per capital employed, and in the process you create high shareholder returns. Now, in the United States, because the US economy as a whole has become less competitive, the people who are again at the base of the pyramid end up suffering. Because if I am not performing as a worker in an automotive factory vis-a-vis someone in Japan or Germany or China, obviously I get either fired or I cannot ask for more salary than I am being paid today because I'm not as competitive. So I think the fundamental focus has to be on competitiveness, global competitiveness of companies. Now, it's very sad when I look at Germany, for example. Germany, the wage rates are about $50 an hour, whereas the United States is about $24 an hour. But look at a German car versus look at an American car. In Japan, the wage rate is about $36 an hour. Look at a Japanese car versus look at a US car. Now, whom do I blame? Or who should take the responsibility? Partly it is the responsibility of the automotive companies' top management, that how to ensure that the people who are working in the assembly lines are as competitive. And in the process, it is also their responsibility that they are earning more. As a CEO, I would like to see that everyone who's working in my company is earning more every year. And that's part of my responsibility in addition to serving customers and shareholders. Now, somehow, somewhere, US top management have lost that connection, that I have to also be responsible to the people who are working in my company. So if each company in this country followed this particular principle, and at the same time the US government and the state governments were conscious that their education system has to be such that we could continuously turn out high-speed individuals, high-velocity individuals, whether they're working at an assembly or whether they're working in the stock market or in the financial markets, that they connect with ideas rapidly, the country would be competitive, wage rates would go up, and in the process you would see the gap between rich and poor declining. But now, the way the technologies are working, it is helping the rich and it is not so much helping the poor unless someone on his or her own will take the initiative. I think the role of the government is to create a system where everyone would be charged to become more responsible members of society.
Thanks. That's great. Now, you mentioned a little bit about the increasing uncertainty in the world today. Now, keeping the spirit of the business's perspective, in a world of increasing uncertainty, how should we plan for the unknown from a business point of view while pushing forward with an existing plan or strategy?
One thing I always encourage my clients, fortunately because of my management consulting profession that I'm in, I get exposed to all kinds of companies around the world. I encourage them to do more scenario planning. It is clear that the world is uncertain. Would be wrong to say that, look, this will happen, this will not happen. What I think we could do today, given the forces at work, be able to sort of visualize what are the uncertainties, what are the possibilities, what could we take advantage of. If you're going down one lane and that lane is all of a sudden closed, what are the other lanes which might be open? That's what I call scenario planning. That being able to be ready to deal with uncertainties. That's point number one. Point number two, I encourage my clients all to develop organizational flexibility. Because it's nice to be able to look around and look for new lanes, but your company should be resilient enough, supple, to be able to move from lane A to lane B very easily without stumbling. And I've seen many times top management has the ability to see the change of lanes, but they don't have the ability to change the game from lane A to lane B. The third element, which I think is extremely important, is also develop options. I think I've seen in the financial engineering world, Black-Scholes, for example, model has become quite, I would say, accepted within the financial services world. When we go to companies who are in wealth management, investment banking, mergers and acquisition, they talk about Black-Scholes all the time. But I would like to see that the corporate world also uses some of the ideas of Black-Scholes model, how to design options. So if one option closes down, what could be the other options they could take, how to hedge against risks so that you can deal with the sudden changes in the economic setup. It could be technologically driven, it could be sudden terrorism somewhere, or sudden natural disaster like what we saw in Japan, the Fukushima disaster. So I think we have to learn increasingly how to deal with this unforeseen changes, and that's why I think the strategic planning process has to move towards.
Thank you very much. Now, you touched a little bit on this in your previous answer, but could you go into a little more detail as to what factors you might take into account to help your clients make some of these difficult choices?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think, for example, if I'm looking at the automotive system company, let's say my client is General Motors. One is to fully understand the General Motors ecosystem and start thinking of how the demographic changes in the oil prices, changes of competitive behavior like Toyota or BMW would affect that space. But that is a very limited way of looking at it, because today's connected world, I have to also think of what are the other kinds of technologies which are evolving, which might disrupt today's automotive model, if you will. For example, new kinds of battery systems are coming up. Companies like Tesla is emerging. On the other side, I could see a lot of high-speed trains between cities, within cities evolving, so people would really not have the need of cars as much. Now the point is, as opposed to getting victimized, if I was running a General Motors, I would also think of what is the play I could create in the new transportation systems which are emerging. Not that I fully get out of automotives, but I would like to keep my fingers in different concepts of transportation. Because as a car manufacturer, I'm in a transportation game. I'm not just in car game. And I think that would become more and more increasingly important. I recall sometime back I had the privilege to study Nikon versus Canon. And Canon ended up winning the game vis-a-vis Nikon. The Nikon in the camera had a better brand name in the 70s. But Nikon viewed itself as a camera manufacturer. But Canon decided, no, we are not in camera really. We are in optical imaging. And as soon as you start looking at optical imaging, they got into fax machine, they got into copying machine, they got into medical electronics, medical imaging. Imaging became the name of the game. And as you would suspect in today's day and age, everywhere you go, imaging has a role to play. So I think time to time, companies have to learn how to step back, look at what is the ecosystem that they want to serve. And sometimes that ecosystem could be significantly larger and meaningful than the ecosystem that they engage with right now.
That's great. Thank you. Now, finally, if we could all sort of take a step back and look at the ecosystem of the world, what are some things that you might say with respect to the various economic challenges in different regions of the world, and what might be the watchwords for each region?
The world, as I mentioned earlier, that was the first question that was raised, I feel is in a state of flux. There's some fundamental changes taking place as to how we think of markets, how we think of the role of the governments, how we think of the people at the base of the pyramid versus how we think of the people at the top of the pyramid. So given those common denominators, which are true whether I'm in Japan or whether I'm in California, but I feel different regions of the world are faced with different kinds of challenges. For example, Japan, where I spend a lot of time, as some of you know. Japan needs to really go through a renaissance. You know, for the last 20 years, it has struggled a lot. It had some natural disasters, we know, about 2-3 years ago. It is a country which is based on some very sound principles, and that's why Japan did extremely well between 1950s to 1980s. So somehow Japan had to resurrect its, I would say, the fundamental principles on which the country was built. I think what happened was in the 90s till today, Japan was kind of, I would say, prostituted, if I may use the word, between two sides of the equation. One side holding on to the Japanese way of doing things and yet trying to westernize. Neither they could westernize, at the same time they lost some of the old Japanese ways of doing things. I think Japan has to reclaim the principles on which Japan built the economy in the 60s and 70s and then engage with the 21st century. So that's Japan. When I look at China, I think the problem is very different. China has done extremely well in the last 30 years, but at the same time I see it runs a danger of not making the economic model as inclusive as it should be. So I think the real challenge is how to ensure it continues the path it has traveled in the last 30 years, but make that path significantly more inclusive and not based around few cities or few economic regions, really go towards a distributed economic development model. And I think China can do this. Unlike India, China has got a lot of reserves. It's got a positive trade balance. Its financial resources are significant. And China is also proud of its old Confucius philosophy, which I think some of the strong powers in China has become more and more conscious of, that we have to restore some of the past heritage while we connect with the 21st century. So China has got that challenge. And I feel quite positive China will be able to make the transition. India, I must say, that has to learn to step back. I think everything has gone wrong in India in the last 30 years, as much as there's a lot of hype in the Western press. But on one side, I see a significant increase in corruption. The gap between rich and poor has increased. People at the base of the pyramid still do not have the social infrastructure, educational infrastructure. And as a result, they also have lost trust in the government. And there's so many different parties, a lot of time and money is wasted on party politics as opposed to economic development. So I think my recommendation to India would be to really step back, think of the fundamentals, think of the past heritage, the Vedic philosophy, and then think of how to recraft an economic process which is different from what it is today. Now, when I look to Eastern Europe, there again I feel there's a bit of a challenge. Coming out of communism, moving towards capitalism is not coming easy, naturally, because as part of the communist setup, you tend to sort of not feel how responsible you have to be when you're part of the capitalistic setup. So I think that transition, has to be managed smoothly. Few of the countries have managed it very well. Many others are still struggling. Now, when I come to Western Europe, there's another challenge, the debt challenge again. I think the governments are suffering from very, very high levels of debt. But within Western Europe, I think I am very, very proud of the way Germany has managed itself. It's a very, very successful economy. It has become almost like a mother of the European community. And also I'm very, very proud of the northern economies, the Scandinavian economies, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark. There I see that on one side it continues to grow in terms of economic growth, which when you look at GDP per capita. On the other side, the social infrastructure is extremely geared to serve each and every individual in equal fashion. Now, when you come to North America, I feel, as we have discussed earlier, we need a fundamental shift. I don't know how it will come, given the gridlock in Washington. But on the other side, I'm very hopeful. U.S. have always been the center of innovation. If there's a new economic paradigm which would be born in the 21st century, I feel it would be born in this country. But then people have to be significantly more supple and resilient, being able to accommodate different thoughts, and in the process create the future direction, if you will. Now, the final is South America and Africa. South America is going through a very interesting process. Many of the South American countries are a bit socialistic, and they've done quite well. They're generally rich in natural resources. So I think the challenge there would be how to strike a good balance between socialistic instincts and capitalistic instincts as well. And I think when I talk to my friends from South America, I think they are learning how to strike a good balance between these two kind of instincts. When I come to Africa, I feel, firstly, I should not use the term Africa, because Africa has got different kinds of countries. To just put Africa into one basket and say that I can talk about African challenges. I think in Africa, you've got North Africa, countries like Egypt have got set of problems which are different from the West Africa, like Nigeria, versus Kenya, which is East Africa, and South Africa, which is South Africa. Now, but there are some common denominators. There, the real question is, given the continent is resource rich, how to manage the process which is not similar to Middle East, where a few people become rich and others kind of keep on struggling. I could see elements of that. But how to really create a bottom-up movement, where I feel positive when I see the Boston Marathon. Year after year after year is the young girls or boys from Kenya or Ethiopia win the Boston Marathon, and they come from small villages. I think if that spirit could be spread, that people at the village level are becoming global players, not only in running marathon, but running businesses, running economic processes. I think Africa could really make a big difference, because one thing I feel very good about Africa, that there's a lot of physical energy. When I go to Nigeria, I see that energy all over the place, in a small village, on the roads of Lagos, and similarly I see that in Kenya. And I think that's what I think at the end of the day makes a difference, is the people at the base of the pyramid, how they are empowered and how they represent their villages on the global stage. And some of those elements are happening, like the Nigerian soccer players playing in London, for example, the English Premier League or European League, and they come from small villages. And that makes a huge difference. that when you see people from a small village performing on the global stage. So I think, overall there are interesting challenges across the world, but one common password that I would use is that we have to manage the transition with a very open mind. Every region in a state of transition. And we should be able to step back and think of what is good for our economy and then connect with the global economy.
From talking to you, it feels like at the bottom of it all, it's the human attitudes and the human thinking and intellect that goes way into developing the shapes of economies of the world.
I think so. I think we are at a point where we have to really think of how to advance our inner conscience so that we could put the interest of social good ahead of our self-interest. And that is a fundamental switch I think we should be looking forward to. But the world is full of opportunities. I think it's for the young people to take advantage of it. But, you have to start thinking of how you could give birth to new models as opposed to tweaking with the old models.